So I'm Scott Ward, here to present on the demographic evaluation of Chrysopsis floridana populations in Southwest Florida. And I have a few co-authors here as well. This is a collaborative project with Bach Tower Gardens. So a little introduction here. Chrysopsis floridana is a perennial herbaceous species of aster. It's endemic to 5 counties in Southwest Florida. It occurs naturally in scrub-like habitats. Scrub's a little bit different out there compared to the Lake Wells Ridge, and of course adjacent fire lanes and disturbed areas, as so many of these rare things occur in. It was federally listed in May of 1986, and this was primarily due to its limited distribution, threats from development, habitat degradation, and at the time, limited known protection on public lands. So currently the population number is up to about 40. This includes both wild and introduced populations. So we're sort of interested in answering this question of how they're doing. And then on this map here, here are the populations that we sampled for this study. This includes Highlands County at the furthest east and then up to Pinellas County. Just a reminder, Chrysopsis, I'd like to think of as inherently Floridian, even more so than swamphead. Here, it's without the genus, we certainly would be much less speciose in North America. So it's a pretty important genus as far as Florida plant ecology goes. So it occurs in sort of scrub-like habitats, not quite as scrubby as Lake Wells Ridge. That kind of looks like this. Introductions now occur in habitats similar to dry prairie or scrubby flatwoods in some cases. And historically, actually, it was collected in 1921 by John Kunkel Small in coastal dunes, the area now pretty developed, known as St. Pete Beach in Pinellas County. So historically, it was known from these dunes. These areas, of course, especially scrub, are prone to frequent forms of disturbance in the form of fire. This kind of what these habitats look like. They're sort of reset as soon as the fire goes through the area. And then these adjacent areas like fire lanes are often prone to disturbance in the form of mechanical maintenance. So fire lane disking or sort of plowing, if you will. This is done as a sort of safety measure for when managers come through to bring fire. And of course, this can sort of trigger plant ecologists, if you will, based upon the death that this can cause for some of these roadside plants, but it's sort of a necessary evil for fire management. So to get into the methods of our study, from 2017 to 2019, we studied 10 populations using intensive demographic means. This included both 5 wild populations and 5 introductions. At each population, we set up 10 2-meter squared rectangular plots. These were plots that had Chrysopsis plants already established, as you can kind of see here in the picture. And then within each plot, we then marked each live plant with a unique tag. And so we sort of followed these plants for the three years. By 2019, we had actually monitored almost 3,000 tagged plants, kind of a relatively small study compared to some of the plant ecology lab projects. Within each fall season, we then measured plants for their survival status, whether they're alive or dead. And for live plants, if they were only vegetative, if they only had rosettes present, for instance, we just measured the rosette diameter. And then if they were reproductive, then we measured the longest stem height. We took the width of the rosette diameter at its widest point. We counted the number of reproductive stems, and then on a subsample of these reproductive plants, we actually counted the number of flowering heads as well. And then on another subset of the populations, we use a less intensive means of demographic sampling, kind of I'll call it stage class monitoring, where we also set up 10 plots, but this was just in 7 populations. And within each 2-meter radius plot, we marked and counted all plants present. We categorized each plant as either being sort of small vegetative, also seedlings fell into this category, larger vegetative plants that had multiple rosettes, and then reproductive plants, basically any plant with any reproductive stems present. Took a total count of each stage type in these plots. And so in 2019, for instance, we counted over 3,000 plants. This is across 8 sites, but I'll just report on 7 of the sites. One of the sites, Highlands Hammock, we did a full census because it was smaller. And then lastly, we collected a suite of microhabitat variables in plots that contained Chrysopsis floridana, aka occupied plots, and then also unoccupied plots where it was absent. And this was done at both demographic and stage class populations. So we're interested in answering a few questions. First, how do the introductions compare to the wild populations? This kind of leads to question 3, looking at stage class results as well, and how that reveals some information about other populations. How did the plants growing in roadside plots compare to interior scrub plots? How are these populations faring overall? Which could we sort of categorize as healthy and not so healthy? And then lastly, what are the possible effects of microhabitat on Chrysopsis occupancy? So to get into the results, just use some basic t-tests to compare these vital rates, these survival vital rates between introductions and wild populations. So if you look here on the top right here, graph A, it shows AS annual survival in 2018 and 2019 of introductions compared to wild populations. And you can see it was significantly higher in both years. And seedling annual survival in 2018 and 19 was also significantly greater in these introductions compared to wild populations. Similarly, plants growing in scrub plots had significantly higher annual survival rates in both years compared to road plots, and also seedling annual survival rates. So overall, introductions in scrub plots had much higher vital rates. And I won't show the figure, but additionally, we counted more flowering heads introduced populations compared to wild populations, and road plots compared to scrub plots. However, that didn't necessarily translate to higher seedling output. Seedling output was higher in introductions, but it was actually higher in scrub plots. So fecundity did not always translate to seedling output. So we had all these vital rates that we calculated for each population, and we actually combined them into this sort of overall score that we could use to standardize each population compared to the other populations. So mean of 0 represents kind of that average health of the overall population. And then a z-score of above 0 is above average health, and below 0 is below average health. And you can see here the color of the bar represents if the population is an introduction or a wild population. And overall, the two most healthiest sites were both introductions. However, there were also wild populations that ranked above average, and the same thing kind of goes for below average. So we had good introductions in wild populations. We also had ones that were not faring as well in both types. So overall, the z-score, the average z-score was just slightly higher for introductions, but both sides of the spectrum for both. So for stage class results, 4 out of the 7 sites here, you can see here's a total count of each site. And this is just for 2019. And then this is the type of stage class that we counted for each site. So we have small vegetative and large vegetative, and then flowering, number of flowering or proportion of flowering plants. So you can see for these 4, we had high overall counts and pretty high proportions of vegetative plants, which essentially translate to is recruitment happening. It's nice to have a lot of flowering plants, but if it's not translating into the next cohort of seedlings or vegetative plants, and doesn't necessarily represent a viable population, or at least a healthier population. So for 3 of the populations, we had consistently low counts and relatively high proportions of flowering plants, but not necessarily lots of recruitment that was evident in these stage class counts. And also similarly, we had both wild and introduced populations doing well and poorly, so also kind of mixed. So to get into the microhabitat differences between plants with and without Chrysopsis floridana, if you look on this figure, it'll show the sort of percent cover of each cover of each microhabitat variable compared with occupied sites and unoccupied plots. So if you look here, occupied sites overall had significantly higher covers of bare sand and forb cover, whereas sites that did not support Chrysopsis floridana had higher covers of litter, shrub, and subcanopy. Litter kind of makes sense paired with shrub and subcanopy, a lot more litter being deposited. And in fact, litter and shrub were highly significantly greater in unoccupied plots compared to plots with Chrysopsis. So just to kind of wrap things up here, the introductions are mostly doing well, which is great news. Bok Tower did a lot of work sort of getting these introductions out there, and some of them are doing pretty well. So it's good to find out. Recruitment and seedling survival sort of reflects this health. Although there are definitely some wild populations and some introductions as well that are not faring too well. We think that might have something to do with either sort of lack of management or aggressive management. Introduced populations in scrub plots had the highest adult and seedling survival rates compared to wild populations in road plots. Both population types ranked above average. Introductions were just slightly higher though. Duet North in Manatee County had the healthiest demographic population. For anyone who's ever been to Duet, it's a fairly nice site and lots of good habitat and not too fragmented, so it makes sense. They get fire in there as well. Although there was higher fecundity in roads, higher flowering head counts, there was higher seedling output in scrub plots. And both were actually higher in introductions. 4 of the 7 stage class sites showed relatively healthy stage class structure and high annual counts. And they were both introductions and wild populations. And lastly, microhabitat variables indicated that Chrysopsis occupancy is better predicted by higher covers of bare sand and forb cover compared to higher litter, subcanopy, and shrub cover. So just a future directions that we can sort of take this project. It'd be nice to have more annual data to eventually incorporate into some modeling or to some population viability analyses. We'd also want to explore a little bit more the effects of fire and management on things like recruitment and population health. Right now we have some data, but we don't have all data for all of the demographic sites. Eventually it would be interesting to compare Chrysopsis floridana to data that we have on Chrysopsis highlandsensis and delaney, especially highlandsensis, considering we have much more annual data on this species than the other two. And then the work for the next few years in collaborating with Bok Tower might investigate the possible effects of soil microbiome and just further analyze the health of these introductions and if they're still doing well. So yes, of course, more data is always valuable to ecologists. I'd like to acknowledge a suite of people, especially Annika and KT for just collecting a lot of the data prior to me coming to Archbold, as well as Phil Gonsiska, Bok Tower, Archbold, the countless interns and research assistants who have sort of guided this project also before I came here. I'd like to thank U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Florida Forest Service for funding and support, and the various agencies that helped us with land access and provided management information. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Scott. We do have a couple of questions. Martia Saha wanted to know what may be the reason for better survival of the introduced populations over the wild ones?
Well, some of the wild populations are kind of relegated to, there are some scrub plots, but a lot of them are relegated to these sort of remnant habitats, and the suitable habitat adjacent to it is kind of overgrown, and some of the wild plots haven't been burned in a long time. And then I think also just the quality of the site selection, that the sites that were chosen for the introduction, some of them are just really, I think, really kind of nice ecologically. So I think it's a combination of those two. Plus, you know, these introductions are relatively, they're still kind of short term. So there might be some underlying effects that we still don't know about if we keep monitoring.
Great. We also have a question from Betsy Boughton. Do you have any plans to look at the influence of soil moisture and relative elevation?
I think soil moisture would be really interesting. Um, I was thinking it'd be interesting to look at wetter winters and see if, because I think that might have an effect on certain Dicerandras and other and Chrysopsis howlandsensis on seedling output. So I think that would definitely be, especially precipitation. As far as elevation, I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that more, but I definitely think the soil moisture would be good.